Hey everyone, Tin Man here with another competitive deck tech. Today we're going to be talking about Total Justice, a Primal, Shadow, and Justice control deck. This is a natural successor to one of my previous deck techs, Total Recall, which you can check out the deck tech in the description below. For those of you who might be unfamiliar, these are unitless control decks, as in we play 0 units at all, and we rely on spells or relic weapons to win the game. Now, this is important because a lot of the opposing decks that you might run up into are going to be playing cards like Harsh Rule, or Slay, or Wanted Poster, or Permafrost. All of these cards are completely and utterly dead against us. They don't do a single thing. So a lot of your opponent's interaction is completely blanked by playing a unitless strategy. So we switched to Justice as a third color as opposed to Time from the Total Recall version. Now that's important because the meta has shifted slightly with most recent balance patch about a week ago. You can check out my patch notes video as well. The meta has somewhat shifted away from the Ikaria and Makto type decks that rely on Inquisitor, Makto, and Ikaria. Whenever those decks were very popular, we had to run a lot of Rain of Frogs and a lot of Vara's Choices in order to discard them out of the opponent's hand, because those cards are difficult for us to deal with once they resolve. However, the meta's kind of shifted away from those type of strategies and more towards aggro and mid-range strategies, which necessitate Harsh Rule specifically over Stray into Shadows. Harsh Rule is obviously a much better card. It just straight up kills the units rather than just giving them -4 health. And the -4 health didn't do very much against time-based mid-range decks that are playing Sandstorm Titan, World Bear Behemoth, etc. Those cards are caught by Harsh Rule, and it actually makes those type of matchups dramatically better. We also play a couple other Justice cards, which I'll get to as they become important. So to start discussing this deck list, I'm actually going to switch out of this full deck list, and we're going to go to talk about just the core cards that are very important to the deck. So the deck is kind of divided into two halves. You have core cards that you almost never cut. These are cards which are here on the screen right now. We've got Strategize, Vara's Favor, Devastating Setback, Extract, Wisdom of the Elders, Feeding Time, Harsh Rule, Celestial Omen, Channel of the Tempest, Sword of the Sky King, and Last Word. These cards are cards that you're almost always going to play in the quantities that I'm showing here, with some leeway around the actual finisher cards, Sword of the Sky King and Last Word. But pretty much everything else, I really like the quantities that they're at right now. And throughout all of my tinkering with the deck, these cards have remained constant. These cards are just always going to be your consistent cards. Your Strategize and Wisdom of the Elders obviously are card advantage and card selection. Vara's Favor is doubling as part of your power base, but it's very important to be able to contest opposing early units, gain some life, and also be able to pop Aegises either on units or your opponent's face. Devastating Setback is a very versatile card. It is both a Lightning Storm half as well as a Duress or Sabotage type effect. So it plays into both types of matchups, the aggro and control matchups. Extract is, for my money, the best card in the deck. It does a whole lot against every deck out there. It's probably at its weakest against mid-range, but against aggro, it is a backbreaker. It kills their unit, it gains you life, it sets up your next draw step. It does so many great things against aggro decks. I would never play this deck without 4 Extract. Feeding Time, I generally tried to avoid putting direct removal in here, but I think Feeding Time is the one removal spell you absolutely have to have. It, along with Extract, are kind of the main reasons for staying in Shadow as a secondary color, secondary to Primal. Because Feeding Time is the great answer to everything. Every individual unit, Feeding Time answers very well. It's primarily best against things like Inquisitor Makto or Dawnwalker, who have a type of recursion effect, or really any revenge unit. But in a pinch, of course, it can be used on things like Tavrod, Impending Doom, World Bear Behemoth, Sandstorm Titan. It's a removal spell you always want, I would say, at least 3 of. Harsh Rule, I kind of alluded to it before. It's a sweeper card that is one of the primary draws of playing Justice. It's amazing against aggro decks. It's amazing against mid-range decks. In fact, this card single-handedly switches mid-range decks from mediocre to poor matchups for the Total Recall deck to extremely favorable for this Total Justice deck. The other core cards here are the late game cards. 1 Celestial Omen, 4 Channel the Tempest, 1 Sword of the Sky King, 1 The Last Word. So you really want to be playing Channel the Tempest. It's one of your primary ways to take an advantage and turn it into a can't lose situation. If you're able to get out to turn 8 and you're not dead, you've generally been able to deal with the opponent's board with removal spells. But then Channel the Tempest kills their last guy, draws you a bunch of cards, which are now more removal spells, or if you've drawn multiples, you start throwing them at your opponent's face and can kill them that way. Sword of the Sky King and Last Word are additional ways of ending the game, because Channel the Tempest alone actually has a limited amount of damage it can do. It can only ever deal 12 damage at once. So if your opponent, say, has gained a bunch of life because they're a life gain deck that are out of range, Channel Tempest may not be able to kill them. So with that, we have some relic weapons, Sword of the Sky King and Last Word, that can actually end the game, you know, despite how much life total they may have. Now, I will say a word about Last Word here. Previously, I'd used a thing like Solitude as a win condition that kind of ignored life total. The problem with Solitude, it's a ton of fun, don't get me wrong. But first off, we're not playing Excavate anymore, which means the double Solitude type plays, you know, where you Solitude, Excavate, Solitude back, and then cast it again. You cannot do that in this version. Whereas the Last Word, occasionally you might get up to 18 power. It's rare, but it happens. But more often the gameplay is you play it on turn 9, after you've both been top decking for a while, and just your opponent is generally going to be drawing a card, playing the card they just drew. They're not going to really hold on to too much. They're going to be trying to be aggressive. So we're going to play Last Word, kill their one guy that they have on board. Then they, you know, play another guy, say. Hopefully, ideally, we have a face Aegis at this time. So they can't, say, use a burn spell to destroy Last Word. But they play a second guy, and then you ultimate it, and then kill their guy. Now, if they play a blocker, obviously the ultimate won't kill them, but it means that next turn, if they play a guy again, you can use your 9 mana to use removal spells, such as the Harsh Rule, Feeding Time, or the other removal spells we'll talk about here in a moment, to clear their guy and then kill them with the ultimate. It actually happens quite a bit more than you think, and unlike Solitude, this card can actively help you to take board control in a situation where otherwise you may not be able to take board control. So I've actually been really impressed with the Last Word as a finisher in this deck. Sword of the Sky King does a similar role, except it does direct damage, but it also doubles as a gain 8 life against opposing aggro decks that you may be low on life against. So these are kind of the core cards, as I mentioned, that I don't think you ever really want to cut, or at least not cut many. So let's go to the optional cards. This is kind of where the deck is you can make or break the deck. And I say that because, unlike most decks in Eternal right now, this deck has a relatively small core of cards that you really can't cut. And in exchange, you get a very flexible deck. There's a lot of different ways you can take it. As you can see, there's you know, a bunch of different cards here that you could conceivably play in your main deck, depending on the meta that you're encountering. Now, some of these are going to be more likely to be better than others, but I really think every card that I've included here could be main decked in given metas. So a lot of these are your more conditional removal spells, things like Permafrost, Annihilate, Lightning Storm, Lightning Strike, Vanquish, Deathstrike, Island's Choice, even Stray into Shadows. These cards, these conditional removal spells, oh, and Bring Down as well. If the meta dictates such, say you're playing against a lot of aggro decks, maybe you want to bring in a lot of Permafrosts, Lightning Strikes, Lightning Storms. Maybe you're playing against a lot more mid-rangey, say like time-based mid-range. You want to bring in more Vanquishes, more Death Strikes, maybe more Slays and Polymorphs. Let's say you're playing against more control decks. Well, maybe you cut down on those removal spells and instead bring in things like Unseal, Island's Choice, Rain of Frogs, things like Azendel's Gift. It's very flexible. I really want to hammer that point home. Oh, sorry. Wisdom of the Elders is actually a core card. It is not really a flex card. It's a card you always want to be playing. I really want to hammer this point home that this is where you have a lot of flexibility with the deck. So any particular deck list that I tell you right now that I'm playing this list, do not take that list as gospel. That list is very flexible. It changes every day, sometimes every couple of games. if I run into a patch of a bunch of aggro players, maybe I up the number of lightning storms I'm playing. It's depending on your rank, the time of day you're playing, just other random factors, you can run into vastly different metas. And being able to be flexible and change around your flex cards here is really the way that it can make a very good deck or a very bad deck depending on your metagame choices. To some people, that's really, really rewarding, and some people that's really scary. If you're just the kind of person who likes to take a net deck and play the exact same 75 card list and just jam it over and over and over again, this deck might not be for you. If you're the one who likes to say, hey, I'm seeing a lot of different aggro decks today, let me adjust my removal suite to accommodate that. Or on the flip side, if you're saying, hey, we're seeing a lot of mid-rangey decks, well, maybe I need to tweak some numbers here and there to improve my matchup against the mid-range decks, then this deck is definitely for you. So some of the other cards outside of the cards I've already discussed, we've got Sabotage, which is good against other control decks that are kind of spell and attachment based. Vision of Austerity is an interesting one that is, you'd be hard pressed to main deck it, but it's very good in the side deck for a tournament. And if if Chalice decks become very popular, then Vision of Austerity obviously shuts down Chalices. It's kind of unusual that I put Rain of Frogs in here as a flex card, despite it being, one of the namesake cards of the deck. But it really is a flex card. It's not very good against aggro decks, but it's decent against midrange and extremely good against control. So if you're facing more slower decks, I would put in more Rain of Frogs, and if you're facing only aggro decks, I'd probably cut them as low as I could, or even cut them completely. Some of the other cards I'll touch on here, Duelist Blade is a card that I don't think a lot of people give a lot of credit to, but it's actually extremely good in both aggro and control matchups, while it is a little bit weak in the mid-range matchups, where 4 damage doesn't really kill many of their threats. So why it's good in aggro deck or against aggro decks is that first off, it comes down and kills a guy for 4 damage. Second off, it gives you a Face Aegis, which can help save your life against a Torch or an Obliterate. And then also just gives you 4 life, just has 4 armor on it. So for all of those things, it does a lot to stabilize you once your opponent is down to just playing 1 or 2 units on the board at a time. Against control decks, it's quite good because they probably don't have too many ways of dealing with it. If they don't have units out on the board, and if they do have units, you can just remove them because you're overloaded with removal spells. But if they don't have units, oftentimes they rely on direct damage. But now you have a Face Aegis for just playing this. So oftentimes you can just play this on 5 against an opposing control deck and just bash them 2, 3, 4 times, whatever it might be. Now you have a clock on them and forcing them to respond, all for a fairly low investment. The fact that it's 2 different influence requirements actually makes it very easy to cast, which we'll talk about the power-based here in a second. Staff of Stories is a similar kind of deal, but it's only really good against the control decks, not so much against the aggro or mid-rangey decks. Strain of Shadows is, I think, just a strictly worse version of Harsh Rule, but against aggro decks is the only time you'd bring it in, because it's slightly easier to cast. Double Shadow is a little bit easier to get because you have Vara's Favor than, say, Double Justice. And against aggro decks, Strain of Shadows is functionally equivalent to Harsh Rule. And depending on what kind of decks you're running up against, you may want Solitude or Azendel's Gift as a win condition. So with that in mind, I'll go back to the main deck and show you what I propose as a current version, as in right now on March 2nd, 2018, I think is good for ladder climbing. This is the list we started off with. As our flex spots, we're running the full complement of Lightning Storms, Lightning Strikes, a handful of Slays, Deathstrikes, and Feeding Times, a mere 1 Rain of Frogs, 3 Duelist Blades. This is really teched heavily against the aggro decks. Some cards like Deathstrike and Rain of Frogs are obviously not great against aggro decks, but we're packing so much of the other hate. The Lightning Storms, the Lightning Strikes. However, we could, if we really ran into even more aggro decks than I'm expecting, you could cut some of these cards for some permafrosts as more early game removal. So now let's talk about the mana base or the power base of the deck. Uh, I'll say it right now, the power base is horrible. It's easily the weakest part of the deck. And I'd be very curious to see if someone could make a better power base than I have here. We have a lot of power that enters play depleted. We've got a lot of seats of Cunning and Vengeance, Seat of Order as well. And we only have, what, 4 Sigils, 3 Shadow, 1 Primal. So these are going to be enter play depleted most of the time. We also have Crest of Cunning, Crest of Vengeance. Obviously, those cards are great. Very happy to include those because they help set up your draws. But then we're also playing Hooru Banner, which, if you'll remember, we're not playing any units, so why the hell are we playing Hooru Banner? Really, when we were testing, when I was testing this deck out, I realized that Justice was the hardest type of influence to get. And we really needed double Justice a lot for Harsh Rule. And for a while, I was even playing Auric Runehammer rather than Duelist Blade, which further complicated my requirement for double Justice. And there, unfortunately, is just not any more Justice, dual faction Justice power. I wish there was a Hooru Crest, but there's not, unfortunately. We could play, say, more Seat of Vengeance, but most of the time, like I said, these seats are enter play depleted, and we actually don't need any more Shadow influence. Both of these, the Seat of Vengeance gets you Shadow as well as Justice, and we're hurting to get more Shadow. We have the Vara's Favors, which we want to play as a core card, which will naturally let you get your double Shadow. So if you look at the power requirements, you've got Devastating Setback, Extract, Deathstrike, all requiring double Shadow, but you have no triple Shadow or anything more than that. The problem is that these are all early game cards that you want to be able to cast right on time, so you want to have a lot of Shadow to get double Shadow as early as possible. However, as you transition into the mid game, you also want to get double Justice by turn 5, which is absolutely not trivial, which is why we're playing so many of these dual Justice power sources. However, we can't really skimp out on Primal, because if you look at our graph up here, half of our deck and half our influence requirement is Primal, and a lot of that comes from Channel the Tempest. We need to get quad Primal by turn 8. When you compound that with the double Shadow on 3 and 4, the double Justice by 5 to get quad Primal on 8, means that most of our power really, really has to have at least 2 influences on it. Which is why we run so few actual Sigils. We run Cobalt Waystone because it's, just getting a face Aegis is just so impactful. But then after that, everything has to provide 2 influence. And very often we were finding that we needed Justice. We wanted more Seat of Orders. I just wanted more and more Seat of Orders. Obviously, I can only play 4, so Hooru Banner is the next best thing. All in all, though, this many depleted lands is not often that detrimental. Generally, if you can afford to play behind tempo quite a bit because you have so many catch-up type spells. You have Lightning Storms, Devastating Setbacks, that if you're being delayed for a turn or two, you can catch up on tempo by just having a lot of board wipes. And your removal is generally more efficient to remove their threats than their threats are. They're paying 4 or 5 for a guy, and you slay it for 3. They're attacking with a 3-drop, you're lightning striking it for 2. So you can afford to play behind tempo a little bit. As long as you have one of these untapped powers to be able to cast on a critical turn, say you really need to cast Harsh Rule on 5, you just make sure you play out all of your depleted power before turn 5, and then your one undepleted power that you have in hand, save it so that turn 5 can happen right on curve. Same with turn 8 when you want to be casting Channel the Tempest or possibly Sword of the Sky King. But on pretty much every other turn of the game, you can afford to play a depleted land. But the kind of key turns are 5 and 8. Of course, depending on the matchup and your specific hand. So that just about sums it up. You can take a look at this exact deck list, but remember, please remember that this deck is good as of today, and tomorrow I might be changing the numbers depending on what I'm playing against tomorrow. The meta does shift quickly, and being able to react to the meta that you're seeing with a lot of those flex cards that I talked about earlier is going to be very key to maintaining a strong win rate with this deck. I really do think this deck is amazingly positioned in the meta right now. So many people are running removal spells that are dead against it. but it also is very flexible. It can answer anything that you want. It can't quite answer everything at once, though. But it's still a very strong game plan that has a lot of consistency with its early card draw and scout effects. So it's definitely a competitor no matter what you're up against. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. Be sure to check out the gameplay video, or you can check out my Twitch channel to check out more awesome gameplay. I want to thank all of my subscribers here on YouTube. We recently hit 100 subscribers. It's been awesome. I love the support that you guys have. So thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video. Have a nice day.